Imperialism in Japan. Western imperialism in Asia dramatically changed Japan. Let's quickly review Japanese history. Ancient Japan was a territory divided by clans that borrowed ideas from China, like Buddhism, emperors, writing, and architecture. By the mid-11th century, Japanese feudalism began. Japan was ruled by regional landowners called daimyo. Daimyo were served by loyal warriors called samurai. And the emperor had little power. From 1192 to 1867, Japan was ruled by military dictators called shogun. From 1560 to 1600, three powerful shogun unified Japan: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa unified Japan in 1600 and created a strong line of succession called the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan until 1867. Let's pick up with our notes. European merchants and missionaries first arrived in Japan in the mid-1500s. Japanese shogun enjoyed trade with Europeans and were fascinated by their military and technologies. But rapid conversion of Japanese to Christianity worried Tokugawa, who banned Christianity in 1619. To protect Japan from European influences, Tokugawa shogunate banned all foreign merchants and missionaries. By 1639, Japan adopted a closed country policy, and Japan entered an era of isolation that lasted for 200 years. During this era of isolation, the Japanese allowed one port at the Shima in Nagasaki Bay to remain open, but only to Dutch and Chinese merchants. The Japanese did more than trade with the Dutch. They also learned from them about new Western ideas. These Dutch studies helped Japan learn about some of the new scientific and industrial technologies in Europe. From 1640 to 1853, Japan was isolated, while the rest of Asia became imperialized by Western powers. In the early 1800s, Britain, France, Russia, and the USA tried to negotiate trade rights in Japan. The Japanese repeatedly refused Western trade. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Harbor with 4 well-armed steamships and demanded that the Japanese trade with the USA. Japanese officials realized they were overmatched by U.S. naval ships. When Matthew Perry returned in 1854, Japanese officials signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opened 2 ports to American merchants. After the United States opened the door to Japanese trade in 1854, other Western powers entered Japan. By 1860, England, France, the Dutch, Russia, and USA all had unequal trade treaties and extraterritorial rights in Japan. Japanese were angry that the shogun had given in to foreigners' demands and feared Japan would become as powerless as China. In 1867, the Tokugawa shogun stepped down, which brought an end to 600 years of military dictatorship. Emperor Mutsuhito took control of the government and took the title Meiji, or enlightened ruler. The Meiji emperor realized the best way to end Western influence was to modernize. Japan sent diplomats to Europe and America to study Western ways and adapt them to their own country. Japan admired Germany's government and used it as a model to create a new constitution and parliament. Japanese leaders eagerly supported industrialization and began building modern factories. They also built railroads, steamships, and steel bridges. Japan built a modern military by modeling their army after the Germans and their navy after the British. Japanese officials reformed education using models from German, American, and French public schools. Western fashions became popular in Japan. Meiji reforms. Modernization in the Meiji era transformed Japan into the most industrial and militarized nation in Asia. By 1900, Japan had 7,000 miles of railroad track, thousands of factories, profitable tea, silk, shipbuilding industries, and a modern army and navy. The Meiji reforms gave Japan power and respect. Japanese nationalism led to the end of the Western extraterritorial rights and unequal trade treaties. By the 1890s, Japan saw itself as a modern nation that needed raw materials. Like other industrialized nations, Japan began to imperialize in Asia. Japan looked to take Korea, but China always had a claim to the land. The dispute with China over Korea resulted in the Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895. In a short time, Japan defeated the Chinese army and destroyed their navy. For their victory, Japan gained Taiwan and spheres of influence in China. After Japan's victory over China, a rivalry developed between Japan and Russia. From 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War began over control of Port Arthur and Manchuria. During the war, Japan shocked the world by defeating a Western power. In 1905, U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt helped draft the treaty that gave Korea to Japan and removed Russia from Manchuria. Japan's victories over China and Russia transformed Japan into the dominant force in Asia. Western nations relied on Japan to keep order in Asia. Unfortunately, Japanese imperialism surged again in the 1930s and 1940s, which became a focal point of World War II.